We use podcast neighborhoods to identify closely related shows or shows that are reaching the kinds of audiences that we already want to reach. That's the competition. And then we listen.
Welcome to Podland, the last word in podcasting news. It's Thursday, the 11th of August, 2022, at least where I am. I'm James Cridland, the editor of Pod News.
And I'm Evo Terra, podcasting's professional contrarian and the host of Podcast Pontifications. Oh, and I'm also in the Podcast Hall of Fame. James is not. Yet.
Not yet.
And I'm Dan Misener from Bumper. And later, I'll talk about podcast neighborhoods and our new podcast growth agency.
He will. Podland is sponsored by Buzzsprout. Podcast hosting made easy. Last week, 3,310 people started a podcast with Buzzsprout, and now there's Buzzsprout ads to grow your podcast wherever it's hosted.
And we're sponsored by Squadcast, the remote recording tool that creators love. Squadcast has just launched V5 with new features and a brand new look. 4,000 hours of high-quality audio is remotely recorded every week using Squadcast.
Yes, so Podland is where Sam Sethi and I review this week's top podcasting stories covered on Pod News. Sam is currently in Italy, sunning himself and sampling fruit-based drinks. So in Sam's place this week, a fellow beer lover, Evo Terra. Evo, for those who don't know who you are you?
That is a question I have been trying to answer for the majority of my life, and I still don't have a solid answer. Longtime podcaster, first-time co-host of the Podland. Actually, is that
Yes.
true? Did I host for you when you were out at one time? I don't recall, but I know I've been on the program before. Longtime podcaster, as mentioned previously, and pontificator of all things podcasting, and just someone who's been in the game for a very long time and likes to keep up to speed on what is happening in the world of podcasting, and I rely on Pod News to help me get there.
Oh, well, thank you. Yes, I noticed that in Pod News' history of the word podcasting, you were one of the very first in there, and you wrote a book about it as well, I believe.
Did. Yeah, back in 2005, I was one of the co-authors of Podcasting for Dummies, and that was an interesting thing to write, yeah. I also wrote Expert Podcasting Practices for Dummies, which is arguably the worst book title ever. Yeah.
If you go back and you read Podcasting for Dummies now, how much of that is even vaguely
Oh, my
accurate?
goodness. It is hilarious, because occasionally I will grab that book from 2005. Now the good news is they're up to, I think, the fourth edition of it. I ducked out halfway through the second edition because I was done telling people how to start podcasting. I wanted to move into something a little more advanced. Like, okay, now what do we do after that? So I ducked out. My co-author T is still writing it, and a good friend of mine, Chuck, is also the author. And yeah, the new edition is significantly up to date, but the challenge with print is as soon as you put it in print, it's out of date.
Todd Cochran wrote an excellent book as well at much the same sort of time. And it is still available on the internet if you know where to go. And there's wonderful photographs of Todd walking down a street listening to a podcast.
Walking around.
I'm not quite sure why you'd have that in there. It's not the only book that you've written as well. You also wrote a book which I've been actually trying to buy, Evo, but it's very difficult to buy here in Australia. It's about it's some kind of faddish diet, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I wrote a book called The Beer Diet, A Brew Story, and it documented my journey to find out what would happen if the only food and drink of any caloric content I consumed for an entire month was based on sausage and craft beer. What would actually happen? And so I kept a running diary of all the things that I ate and all the things that I drank throughout the week. I'll be honest, sometimes it was more of a recollection the next morning of, what was that again that I did? But I tried to keep a good detailed diary of that. I went to go see the doctor every single week. In fact, the doctor I saw was my co-author of the book and would write some interesting bits inside of it, what we think we know about diets and what we really know about diets. And yeah, I tried that grand experiment. And here's the spoiler. I lost 15 pounds.
Wow.
In those 31 days. And my liver enzymes never blipped above baseline. My triglycerol cut in half, and my really bad cholesterol down by a third. So I'd call that a success, although am I still doing the diet today? No.
No, you've given
It's an entire month of being moderately hungry and moderately drunk the entire time. So, there's always that.
and you've given up. All you've done now is you've just given up the sausage, I guess.
Yeah, right. And I'm not quite as limited to the number either. So there's that.
No, there is always that. And you do Podcast Pontifications, which is a excellent podcast which comes out every sort of few days during the week. What is
Just
it?
once a week
Weekly,
now.
daily?
Yeah,
once a week.
I'm doing it weekly now. I was doing it daily for around 550 episodes. And at some point in time, I realized that's hard. James, do you know how hard it is, James, to put out a daily podcast?
I do know how hard it is.
As a matter of fact, you do. Yes, you do.
Yeah, particularly because you could take that and you could batch record those if you wanted to. Whereas
hard to do with the news.
That doesn't appear to be an issue.
Yeah, definitely.
Still, there we go. Yes, and you are also chief. What shall I call you? Chief CEO.
Sure.
I don't know,
Pick a word.
of Simpler Media as well. So you help other people with their podcast stuff.
Yeah, businesses that want a podcast. I used to run a digital advertising agency, and so I realized, fine, if businesses want to pay someone to help make their podcast, they might as well pay me.
All kind of makes sense. Well, Podland supports both chapters and transcripts. If your app doesn't, you should grab a new podcast app, podnews.net/new podcast apps. And our websites at podland.news for the archive and daily podcast news at podnews.net.
So let's get going with the very first story of this week. Podcast guests are now paying up to $50,000 to appear on popular shows. And those podcasts oftentimes don't disclose it, according to a piece from Ashley Carman, friend of the show, writing in Bloomberg. She quotes a number of podcasts that charge more than $30,000 per interview, and they have only added a full disclosure, which is an FTC, that's the Federal Trade Commission here in the States, requirement after they were contacted by Bloomberg for the story. So, James, would you charge guests to be on one of your shows?
Wow. Well, no, I don't think so. But nevertheless, I think, I guess you could look at it the other way. If I could get onto the Joe Rogan Experience or something which was a bit more obvious for my audience, and I could get on there for $500, would I get on there? Absolutely, I would. Would I spend the $500? Oh, yes. Totally would. So I guess, I'm kind of looking at this and going, yes, it's a bit of sort of peeling back the mystery behind how media works. But there's a fair amount of this that goes on, and it goes on in TV as well, and it goes on those weird audio programs that you can listen to if you plug your headphones into the armrests on planes. There are still audio programs on there, and they charge a phenomenal amount to be on. Yeah. I was sold one of those a few years ago, and I said, no, I do not want to be on there. But they were wanting to charge $5,000 just to be ignored on the, some sort of system. Do you think? Right. Would you charge guests, or do you think that this whole thing is dreadful? Thing.
Well, I don't think it's dreadful at all. I think the dreadful part is not disclosing it. I think that is the story for me. But when I read the article, I was like, well, yeah, that happens. Of course it happens. As you mentioned, it happens in all forms of media. The challenge, or not the challenge, but the right thing to do is simply disclose that up front. For example, on Podcast Pontifications, I do sometimes once a month, sometimes less frequently than that, something I call a branded benefit sponsor. And they have to pay to get someone on the show, and I ask them 3 simple questions. But it's all disclosed several times, before, during, afterwards. I don't want anyone thinking anything other than that. So I have no problem with it if you've got the right audience, or, as you mentioned, a very sizable audience that also might be the right audience. I don't see it as a challenge, again, as long as it's properly disclosed.
Yeah. And how about the other way? A guest wanting to be paid to be on your show.
Yeah, now that happens quite a bit. There are people that are now asking for their appearance fees to do that, which isn't anything unusual. You pay speakers to go to conferences and speak to draw an audience. So I think we'll start seeing more of that happen in the podcasting space. It's happened in the radio space for years, as you know. So I think it's okay, but I guess I feel a little bit different about that one. Do you need to disclose that? Should the show disclose that they paid the guest to show up? That part I don't know. I need to think about that more.
Yeah, because I mean, a show doesn't disclose, that we paid our producer for this show, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So I guess it's a little bit different. I mean, from my point of view, I'm kind of a subject matter authority on a very specific bit of radio. When I've been interviewed a few times by the BBC or by I think CBC was one, and various things, they do give a small amount of money to cover the time that I spent, and I think that's probably fair enough. And it's probably up to the guest if they want to do that, and if you as a podcast host want to turn around and say, well, I'm not putting you on, then that's absolutely fine too.
Yeah, right. Again, I think it's just, let's be above board. Let's not do things sneaky, and it'll all work out in the wash.
Yes, which is usually a good plan. Well, let's move on to story number 2.
Friend of mine and friend of yours, and friend of the show, Dan Misener and Jonas Woost have launched Bumper, a new podcast growth agency. Bumper will work with organizations on audience development strategies, marketing, and promotion. Now, I already teased that we know them, but how do we know these people, James?
Well, they are, I've known both of them for many, many years, but they are most recently from Pacific Content. They're now stepping out on their own. Dan he's so clever. I've known him for a long time. He's one of these people that sits and writes Python scripts and works out how to hack into the Apple Podcast system and everything else. He's pioneered a thing called podcast neighbourhoods. So I spoke to Dan Meisner and I asked him what podcast neighbourhoods were.
A podcast neighborhood is a way of making a map of podcasts and listeners and the relationships between those things. And when I say map, I really do mean a map. It is a visual representation of shows, audiences, intersecting and overlapping audiences, and it's a way of analyzing those things to make decisions about a show that you're thinking about making or a show that you already have. Some people say that the podcast neighborhoods look a little bit like spider webs, or they look a little bit like exploding galaxies. They are beautiful, but more than beautiful, they're practically useful in the day-to-day work of a podcast marketer.
So tell us how practically useful they are. I mean, you did some really interesting research on the Canadian podcast industry. Canada, of course, very much overshadowed by its larger and brasher neighbour to the south. Mm-hmm. And you discovered a lot of interesting things about Canadian podcast content.
Yeah. I got this question from a colleague. She asked me, where do I find a list of the most popular domestically produced podcasts? And I scratched my head and thought, I don't know. I don't know where you would come up with such a list, because it's very simple to put together a list of popular shows, at least by some measures. But it's not so easy to put together a list of domestically produced shows. And the reason for that, as far as I can tell, is there's no universally or even commonly accepted way of adding geographic information about the country of origin or the place of origin of a podcast. I know there are efforts in the works to add geodata to certain podcasts, but not specifically what country did this show come from. And so my colleague asked, where do I find this list of shows that are both popular in Canada and also made in Canada? And I had to think about it for a while. And what I ended up doing is using this podcast neighborhoods methodology to put together a list of all the popular shows in Canada. That's easy enough to do. I just went to some of the popular podcast apps that have charts, and got a list of, across all of the different categories, some reasonable number of shows, about 5,000 different shows, and said, okay, here's the 5,000 most popular shows in Canada. Then the trick was figuring out, well, which of them were actually made here. And what I identified was a heuristic that allowed me to, with some reasonable degree of accuracy, predict what country the show was made in. And then I overlaid that geographic data on top of the podcast neighborhoods. And you mentioned, Canada and, like many other countries outside of the United States, being inundated with American programming, and American programming in many cases dominating what's popular inside these podcast apps, this gave me a glimpse into just how popular Canadian shows are to Canadian audiences. And from what I can tell, it's about 10% of what's at the top of the charts actually made in Canada. So 10% of the Canadian charts contain homegrown hits.
Interesting. And I wonder how that compares to other countries. I know that I've done research in the past with Pocket Casts, who very kindly gave me a list of the most subscribed shows in Australia and the UK. And certainly the UK had an awful lot of homegrown stuff, Australia less so, as you would kind of expect, I think, because of the BBC. What was the overwhelming finding? Did you find that, Canadian content is strongest in terms of news, which I would guess it might be, or what did you find out?
What I found was that there are 3.5 or 4 content verticals or broad topic areas with demonstrated track records of reaching Canadian audiences with domestically produced content. The first one, you're absolutely right, news and current affairs, and specifically domestically produced news and current affairs largely about Canada, right? So news and current affairs, not hugely surprising there. The second category that seemed to do very, very well, sports. And again, sports that are particular to cities or teams based in Canada, not hugely surprising there.
Things to do with ice, I would guess.
Indeed. The third category that did really, really well was, and I'm speaking in generalities here, French language programming. And I say domestically produced French language programming, right? So that's shows made in Canada for French-speaking Canada. And then the 3.5 or 4th category that I found was what I would call personal finance or investment shows, right? Shows about what it is to manage your money in Canada, which requires perhaps a different approach than maybe other parts of the world. And so those aren't the only areas where there are homegrown hits, but if you were looking to place your bets on certain content categories and you wanted some reasonable degree of success, that's where I'd be placing my bets.
Now, there's a very popular TV soap which has just finished here in Australia called Neighbours. And from the lyrics, neighbours should be there for one another. That's when good neighbours become good friends. I guess that podcast neighbourhoods can also be used for growing podcasts too.
Yeah, I've used them in a number of different ways. When working on a brand new project, before we produce a single interview or decide on who the host should be or make any of those editorial decisions, I often recommend listening to other people's shows so that you can avoid duplication and so that you can create something that is meaningfully differentiated in the marketplace. And so I often use podcast neighborhoods first to say, let's identify who's in the competitive set. Whose ears are we vying for? So we use podcast neighborhoods to identify closely related shows or shows that are reaching the kinds of audiences that we already want to reach. That's the competition. And then we listen and try and make something that is different, better in some way or another. But also on the marketing and promotion side, this idea of podcast neighborhoods is very helpful when you're doing things like organic cross promo, whether that's feed drops or promo swaps, also on paid. And the really nice thing about podcast neighborhoods is that they allow us to look at shows in a way that transcends category or genre. Because the neighborhoods themselves are not based on category or genre, they are based on overlapping audiences between shows, right? So you can take a big, broad category like society and culture, which is so broad as to be unuseful, and you can break it up into its constituent parts and find groups of common audiences who are perhaps more likely to be into the thing that you're promoting than if you were to do a big spray and pray type campaign.
So talking about growth, clearly you've been talking about podcast neighborhoods for some time, and people have gone, well, Dan, that's all very well, but we're not a Pacific content client. And so there we are. That's very nice. Now go away. Now, of course, you have a completely different thing, because earlier this week you announced Bumper, a new podcast growth agency for organizations that are looking to find success in the increasingly crowded podcast space. Who and what is Bumper?
Bumper is a podcast growth agency, and I think it's a product of where we're at as an industry right now. Specialization is the name of the game, and we have long put the marketing and promotions and strategy work behind those things on the shoulders of people who might rather be making shows, cutting tape, doing interviews. And I think we're at a place in 2022 where this specialization of, call it podcast growth, call it audience development, call it marketing and promotions for podcasts, deserves a specialty of its own, requires a specialty of its own. And that's what Bumper is trying to do. So we're hoping to work with really smart, forward-thinking podcasters who recognize that it's not enough to make a show. It's not enough to make a show that has a meaningful sized audience. You need to have a show that reaches an audience and also serves your goals. Because audience for the sake of audience, you can chase that if you want. But that's a pie eating contest and the prize is more pie, right? Whereas if you can make a really great show and serve a really big audience and have it serve your organizational goals, maybe that's a brand goal, maybe that's a mission-driven organization's goal, that's the trick. So we're hoping to push that forward and increase this idea that there should be specialization within our industry.
And we, in this case, is...
That's myself and Jonas Woost.
Jonas Woost, also ex of Pacific Content. Now, I first met Jonas in Last FM in the UK a long, long time ago. I first met you when you were producing Spark for CBC in about 2009, I think it was, where I was a guest and I said absolutely nothing good at all. And I've got no idea how I made it to the final cut. But you worked there for 12 years. You left in 2016 to join Pacific Content. How has podcasting changed in that time that you've been heavily involved in producing audio?
The thing that I have been so excited about and so fascinated to watch is the cohort of people who have come into podcasting unencumbered by the tropes and formats and legacy baggage of broadcast. So much of the early days of podcasting was built on top of, not exclusively, but a lot of it was built on top of broadcast formats that were time shifted or made available on demand. You got radio programs whenever you wanted. And many people clung to those formats, those tropes, those ways of making shows that have evolved since then. And so I get so excited when I get to work with new and emerging creators who are coming at this and their reference points are not radio shows from 20 years ago. Their reference points are podcast native digital first productions that never would have had a home on the broadcast dial because it doesn't make any sense. And so I get really, really excited about that now. And I really think that innovation, both in form and in distribution, is what I am most excited about.
It's an exciting time. You'll be talking about podcast neighborhoods at Podcast Movement. So looking forward to seeing you in Dallas and Texas, which I'm guessing is a little bit warmer than where you are now. Although, frankly, I've been in Montreal during the summer, and that was a mistake. How else can people get in touch with you and your colleagues at Bumper?
We are bumper.com is our website, and I'm going to be doing quite a lot of writing there. looking forward to doing more of that.
Dan, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Great to see you, James.
Dan Misener from Bumper. You can find out more at wearebumper.com. So, podcast neighborhoods, interesting. At the beginning of this, you mentioned that Dan is a very clever person. I don't think he's a person at all. I think he's an android. I think he's some sort of a robot that looks at things completely different than the rest of us, but has passed the Turing test. He's really, really good and really smart at what he does, yeah?
Yeah. Oh, incredibly smart, incredibly smart. And yeah, I mean, all of the tech that he has built, as, you know, I mean, obviously, you know, Pacific Content will still keep an awful lot of that, but now being able to use all of that knowledge for his new podcast growth agency. And I thought it was really interesting him talking about specializing in certain things. There are lots and lots of podcast companies out there who will make a show for you, and they say that they will also market it, and they say that they will also do various other things. But this is a specific thing for growth of a podcast, and I think that's quite interesting.
I like the fact that our industry has evolved to the point where this is viable, where we need something like this, when it's not a one-size-fits-all. You and I are old enough to remember when one of the two of us might have been called a webmaster.
Yes.
Back in the day, right? And that meant we did everything. But, you know, that doesn't exist any longer. Companies used to have webmasters, and now they don't, because now they have entire IT teams that are doing stuff. And I think we're seeing something like that happening, not just in all the special skills it takes to make a type of podcast, especially branded content like Pacific Content was, but also really getting serious behind a true growth strategy for that podcast. Needs focus, it needs dedication, and it needs people with the brains like Dan, like Jonas, to really make it happen.
Yeah, and I think it's a very different skill set, isn't it, than knowing how Hindenburg Journalist works and knowing what plugin to use for X and Y and Z. It's a very different thing, and I think it's a really interesting move. So really looking forward to seeing Bumper succeed, as I'm sure that they will. It's a very good, smart thing. Here's an interesting thing. What a professional Dan is. I had to edit one out of that interview. That was it. There was
robot.
Nothing else.
I'm telling you, he's a robot.
He's a robot.
This is someone... Yeah,
he's an android.
It's amazing.
He's an android. He's not
totally
he's not an iPhone. He's an android.
No, he's not.
Oh, dear. Anyway.
Oh, let's move on to story number 3, shall we?
Yes.
All right. How many downloads does it take to get into the Apple podcast chart? It's kind of like the little question of how many licks does it take to get to the center of a Tootsie Roll Pop. I'm not sure if you catch that reference or not, but it's a very American thing. Regardless of that.
No idea what you're talking about.
Regardless of that, Tanner Campbell has managed to get into the top 100 in the U.S. books category on Apple Podcasts just last Friday. And he only had 10 listens and 24 followers.
Yeah.
Now, that's the lead, but I will jump in and say, again? Because it feels like this is an annual or a many times a year or a rather recurring thing where someone says, I think I'm going to go see how the Apple Podcast charts work. And they always come up with this answer, don't they?
Yeah, well, yes, I think so. And by the way, the US books category of top charts, there isn't actually a top charts books category in your app. So what Tanner is looking at, and this is absolutely fine, but what Tanner is looking at is people who show the books trending chart, as I wish that Apple would call it, but the books trending chart in, through the API. So people like Chartable and Readphonic and those sorts of things. So
no human sees it, right?
So I don't think any humans can see it. Now, humans will see his podcast appear in the arts top chart, which does appear
right, that's the top level.
But I think it is interesting. One of the perennial pieces of feedback that I give Apple, and they always pat my head and they say, "Thank you, James. Now go away." Is change its name from charts to trending, because it's trending. That is what it actually shows. But I can also see on Apple's point of view, and they've just changed their social posting tool to even highlight when you've hit the charts. I can see from Apple's point of view, they really want people to be saying, and we're currently number 6 on Apple's podcast charts, even though it's not a chart.
Yep.
So
right. No, you're exactly right. Yeah.
And of course, it only works on Apple podcasts as well, which of course is another kind of thing. Does it actually make a difference though if you appear in the Apple Podcast charts in your experience?
No, has been my experience of doing that in the past. It's a thing to say that's happened, but as the article you'll read, it's linked in the show notes and the episode details, obviously, it didn't really have a measurable impact on downloads, did it?
No, so far as I can see, no. And there's also another similar article which I discovered for the first time last week from November of last year. Always my finger on the pulse. Stefan Guerrero got into the top 50 using social media. The top 50 overall, the top 50 using basically asking people on social media to follow the podcast, unsubscribe, follow the podcast, unsubscribe. Sure. Unfollow, I suppose, as we should be saying, and managed to get into the top 50, but it had absolutely no effect on his overall downloads at all. So again, it's one of those interesting things.
Yeah, it's a kudos. It's something so you can say I've done that. But an easier way to do it is just Photoshop it. Just take the charts, take a screenshot, figure out what font it is, and just replace it. I mean, make you much happier
SF
and
Pro,
without
by the way, in case you want to know what font it is. But yes, that's
just in case random knowledge that James might have there.
That's a great point. There's always something because I get, as you might guess, quite a lot of press releases, and there's always two sort of red flags when it comes to a press release. One of them is saying, made it into the top 10 of the Apple podcast charts. That's normally a bit of a red flag because, really. And the other one is a top 5% podcast in the world. Which means that
someone's been on Listen Notes.
Exactly. Somebody's been on Listen Notes and they've looked and they've worked out that it's got more than 100 downloads. So, bless them.
Yeah, we have a lot of stats that don't really mean a whole lot, but hey, if it gives you bragging rights and you feel better about it, then I guess fine.
I guess fine too.
All right, so story number 4, Podtrack, who's been around since the beginning of podcasting, I do believe, is now adding a sales network ranker report in the third quarter of this year, according to emails from Art19 to some of its customers. James, break that down for the listener. Sales network ranker.
Yeah, so I think what they're trying to do is basically what you've already got with Triton and you've already got with Edison's podcast metrics, is to basically give people a list of here are the most popular places to buy shows. So they're not showing that in terms of popularity of people spending money, but they're showing, if you want to reach the number one sales network, then you should be going with iHeart, or you should be going with Wondery, or whoever that might end up being. And I think that's really interesting if they're measuring everybody. And I suppose the question here is, are they measuring everybody? And the answer is not really.
No, they are not. It's Podtrack. They do not. They are an incomplete ranker, as I've heard someone who sounds similar to you say on a regular basis.
Yes, I used to say they are an incomplete ranker quite a lot, and then I thought that's just. I think I'm just annoying people now, so I stopped doing that. But they measure participating publishers only, is I believe my new phrase. But yeah, and particularly if you look at Edison's podcast metrics, SXM Media, which is SiriusXM and Pandora, and and a few other things, they are not measured by Podtrack at all,
right?
But they are number one in terms of Edison's podcast metrics, and they're number one in terms of Triton's list as well. And Triton, who is owned by iHeartMedia, does not measure iHeartMedia. It's just like kind of. Do you think that these rankers are useful, or what's the use of them?
Yeah, I think there is use for them, but they're specific use cases, like we've mentioned here. I mean, this is a sales network ranker. So if you are a giant company and you've got literally millions of dollars to spend in podcasting, it makes sense to use a tool like this so you can see where you can buy to get the largest audience possible. Makes perfect sense for that stuff. I think podcasters, most people listening to this program, get tied up in these in these numbers and in these rankers, in these charts, because I'm not sure how helpful they are that way. But I think there's some value in them, again, for individual usage, as well as showing trends. I mean, it's nice to see who's come up, who's come down out of the market. I think there's some value in it, but I will tell you this personally, I pay zero attention to this because it doesn't matter to me, really.
Yes, until of course you're in the top 20, in which case,
right? Yeah, if I was Jordan Harbinger, I'd care about that.
Yes,
more, but I am not Jordan Harbinger, and so I don't care about that.
Yes, more. I think I broke to Jordan himself that he had broken the top 20 of the Podtrack list, and he was hugely excited, wasn't he?
He was very excited. Yes, he's an excitable young man
in our secret Slack,
right? The one we shall not talk about.
Yes.
Talk about. So, yeah, well, good on them for doing something new. I mean, I think you'll see more of these things coming out as again, maturity of the industry and giving charts that mean things to different consumers of the information.
Yeah, indeed. And if you are with the Wondery Sales Network, I've never heard of the Wondery Sales Network, but apparently it exists. It's also used on Art19's targeted audience solution. Anyway, if you're with those, then automatically you're going to get a Podtrack prefix on your feeds, unless you opt out, and you've got until, I think, Friday to opt out. So you basically got until, tomorrow or today, depending on when you listen to this, and depending on how quickly I can edit it. Yes, one thing, though, I have actually asked Podtrack, where's your privacy policy for audiences? Captivate, which you and I were an advisor for, they have a privacy policy for listeners. It's very good. I would say that because I wrote it. I'm just sort of curious. I don't actually know what Podtrack does with that data, because they essentially see the IP addresses and the user agents of every single person that is requesting a podcast from every single publisher who is in the Podtrack ecosystem. I don't know what they do with that data. And it would be quite nice to find out. So I'm not saying that Podtrack do anything nefarious with it. In fact, I'm pretty convinced that they don't. But it would be good to understand what it is that they're actually doing with that.
Yeah, sounds like something that should be stated clearly.
Yeah, I think that would probably be a good plan, in the same way that Acast already does with some of their shows. Story number 5, tips and tricks. I write a section called Tips and Tricks in the Pod News newsletter every single day, or most of the time, every single day when it's sponsored. And I put something in there a couple of days ago saying this section may be a waste of time, argues Evo Terra, in an article entitled "Avoiding the Perils of Unaligned Podcast Advice." What are the perils of unaligned podcast advice?
Well, and as I replied back to you, if the shoe fits. No, I'm kidding. It's not a waste of time at all. But this goes back to the comment about where's the value in the ranker? Does it matter for me? Where is the value in getting in the charts? Does it really matter? There's a lot of podcast advice out there. I know. I'm one of the first people to write books about podcast advice, even though Cochrane's book came out before mine, but that's fine. I gave a lot of podcast advice. I still give a lot of podcast advice, but podcasting has stopped being a one-size-fits-all medium, and it hasn't been that way for a very, very long time. And there are still lots of pundits out there that are giving advice, and it's applicable to some podcasters, but not all. There are hosting companies that write really well done, great. You mentioned Captivate. Captivate's Growth Labs is amazing. Is it perfect for every podcaster? No. It's not. I mean, there are things they suggest you do in there that make no sense for certain types of shows. So my argument in there is, yes, get all the advice you can from people. That's always a good idea, but make sure that their agenda is at least aligned with your agenda. And that doesn't mean growing your show. That's not enough of an agenda. You need to be a little bit more focused on what it is you're looking for, what it is you are offering in your podcast, and whether or not that advice makes any sense. A common piece of advice is get a high-powered guest to be on your show. Well, we can debate whether that's a good idea or a bad idea. It's a worthless idea for my show.
Yes.
I don't have guests,
Yes.
right? So it will not help Pod News at all. You don't have guests. It's not doing that. So that's just one example. So a thought to just remember that just because something is a good idea for someone, it may not be a good idea for you and for your podcast.
Yes, which I think is a very good and very wise thing to remember. Maybe that should be a disclaimer on the on the tips and tricks thing. Advice,
Yeah, right.
Advice given may not be correct for you. Please contact your general practitioner. I don't know, something like that.
Your mileage may vary.
Yes, yes, indeed. And you gave actually a excellent tip and trick as we were connecting, which is if we're using a remote recording tool like Squadcast, for example, then that should be the only Chrome window that you have open. And if you're going to read a script, open that in a different browser completely. So, which is
Don't switch back and forth.
which is a great piece of advice that, frankly, I should take down and use. So I have.
Well, there's my payment for this, for to give you a piece of advice you can use going forward.
Excellent.
I'll call it.
Well, there you go. There's an excellent thing. Right, let's move on to the tech stuff. There's all kinds of weird and wonderful things going on with the podcast verify tag, isn't there, Evo?
Yeah, I took a look at that. So, podcasting 2.0, obviously, listeners to Podland know it's there's always something we're talking about, or quite often something. When clearly you're a big fan of the podcasting 2.0 movement. I too am a big fan of the podcasting 2.0 movement and the new tags that are coming up there. I try to stay involved, but I'm not a developer. And so every time I have to click a GitHub link, it kind of hurts me a little bit to look at that kind of information. But this new podcast verify tag could really cut down on the spam email from Acast or whoever happens to be spinning it this particular week.
Yeah, no, I think it could. So instead of using email addresses in RSS feeds, it uses a simple one-click claiming process, which is just like basically, much the same as login with Apple or login with Google. You basically press one button and it will go off to your podcast host and then come back again. And I learned while I was looking into this, that if you have an email verification system, then what that email verification system does, it sends you an email and it says, do you really want to claim this podcast and blah, blah, blah. 25% of people just go, do you know what? I think I can't be bothered. They lose 25% of people by doing that. So there's a real benefit to get rid of that stuff, get rid of all of the privacy issues with emails in RSS feeds, and instead just simply move on to to this kind of OAuth-like, but not as complicated as OAuth thing. So if you're working for a podcast hosting company, or maybe you're working for a directory or a tool, then please do go and give feedback on that proposal. I believe it's PIMP 2. I believe it's the new podcast improvement, whatever they call it, proposal. Because Dave and Adam are teenagers, and so therefore, obviously they're going to call it PIMP, aren't they? Because that would be hilarious.
Yeah, but why not?
Yeah.
Of course they would. They're going to. Yeah, I tell you, I am looking forward to this one being in there, because part of the process we go through at Simpler Media when we launch a new show for a client is we maintain a list of about 27 different directories and or apps that we submit to, and in order to do that, I've learned very early on that I create a brand new email account for each podcast. And that is the email address that goes in. So Evo's client 123@gmail.com or whatever it happens to be, right? But in order to, that's the email that I get all the email notifications. So those all come to my email. But when I submit these, my production assistant, Allie, does the submitting. She has to log in to that separate Gmail account and field all of the returns, some of which are instantaneous, some of which take days. Pandora takes weeks to come back in the entire process of doing it. And it's just it's a nonstop hassle. It's about a half day's work to submit shows in there. But if it was this simple to where you could submit, claim, go to the hosting page, yep, that was me, fine, you're done. It would take us, an hour and we'd be done with the process. So I really want this to be next.
Yeah, no, I think that is an excellent thing. The other excellent thing coming up, if you do podcast apps, and you use the Apple Core Media SDK to play back audio in your app, then something very exciting is happening in iOS 16, which is the next version of the operating system for those toy phones, is that you will be able to set your user agent. So instead of Apple Core Media, which some podcast hosting companies give to Apple, which is completely incorrect, and some podcast hosting companies ignore, which is also completely incorrect. You will be able to actually set your app's name so that your app gets the credit in podcast host company dashboards. So if you are... if you're anybody that is involved with a podcast host and you're listening to this, then rush off and learn about this new complicated SDK. Just search for iOS 16 in Pod News and you'll find it somewhere in there.
I'm excited about this for one reason. The name and shame you and I will get to do 2 months after it's been implemented.
Yes.
Which apps have not yet changed their user agent, and how can we name and shame them into doing so? Because I think you and I have no problem doing that.
Oh, no, that will be fun.
Well, give them some time. Give them time.
I have already warned people that, oh, yes, I will be doing that. And I've also given, because I've got a full list of those individual apps that use that, because I also go back and use the RSS user agent and various other things. So I've actually given Apple a full list. And I've said,
good.
These are the people, and these are the contact emails. So there should be no excuse.
Yeah. And also, if your hosting provider, I would recommend, listener, reach out to your hosting provider. Make sure they are ready to update that as soon as they possibly can, because just because it's set in there properly, I don't want to see, what I think we will see is Apple Core Media drop drastically, I hope.
Yeah.
But other will suddenly swell and increase, because when your podcast host is parsing that data, they're not necessarily going to know what to do, because they would not have seen these before. So they need a plan for trapping all of these new ones and then doing something with it. So reach out to your hosting company if you have a relationship with them and say, what are your plans?
Yes, and if you want to also mention the OPAWG list, which is free and available for them, OPAWG is the ridiculous name. It's too late to change it now. But that is a free list which a lot of people help put together. So that's a good thing. Right, hey, it's time for my favourite part of this show, which is Boostergram Corner.
Boostergram Corner. You can't get more top 40 than that.
Oh, yes, it is.
Pew.
Yes, pew, pew, indeed. So, yes, we've got lots and lots and lots of messages. Do you want to read the first one here?
Yeah, I will do that. So it was a big row of Dux Boost, which is 22,222 sats were sent in. And the question is, it came in from Castomatic, I believe is what that came from. Yes.
Yes, Castomatic, but we don't know who has sent this.
Yeah,
maybe because they're being slightly rude.
Right. Oh, it could be. It said, give Sam some apple juice, and they put the little emoji of an apple juice box, a pop screen, and 2 fists from the microphone. Hashtag mouth noises. Hashtag reverse ASMR. Oh my goodness. Poor Sam.
This is not nice. And Sam has been reading the script on his holiday while he's there. Sipping his grape-based juice. And he said, in my defense, recording at 5 a.m. doesn't make for a good voice. Absolutely. Doesn't make for a good voice.
No doubt. I definitely understand that one. Coffee, if you're having coffee in the morning, is not a helping thing. It dries things out. Green apple slices.
Green apple slices. Is that your tip? So if maybe getting a nicer microphone. But what's the if people are mouth noisy-ing. And you can hear a bit of this sort of noise. Yeah. What's your tips for that?
Isotope RX9 and their voice denoise.
Oh, it's up to me to clean up, is it?
Mouth declick is a wonderful tool. Every single file we edit at Simpler Media has a mouth declick put on it, and it's kind of wonderful. But the reality is everybody's got a different mouth makes different sounds. It bothers some of us more than it bothers other. I hear some of the most popular, well, actually, I'm going to say let's not talk about most popular, but some of the most influential shows for podcasters, right? People who have been in radio and making work and are making shows that people like you and I and listeners are listening to. I listen to some of those shows, Rob Rosenthal, and it's like, wow, he doesn't care as much about those mouth noises and those deep inhalations of breath that I do. So there's a spectrum. I'm kind of on the side of let's take out what we can, but that's not necessarily a big deal for everyone else.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. And it's one of the reasons why this podcast isn't necessarily as de-ummed or de-eared as some people would like it to be. But also, man, I've got other things to do. Kyrin 4321 Sats says, congratulations on the marriage, James. You can now have a beer. Yeah. You are worthy. Yes, we'll go into that in a minute. Adam Curry has sent us a boob boost. Boob. And he's just sent the word boob. Again, yes. I mean,
in case
teenagers.
You didn't know what it was. I mean, he could have sent you 80 or let's see, what would it be? 8008 135, right? But
yes.
No, you did not get
yes,
that one.
Yes, that would be or there was always 1355.
Yes.
For upside down calculators. Anyway, Adam, thank you very much for your boob boost of 8008 sats. Brian of London sent us an Israel Again boost at 1948 and says, sorry, I'm late paying for the interview a few months back. Topical.
Oh,
nice.
Well, it was. Yeah, although you should charge more for your interviews, James, not just 1948 sats.
1948 sats is it's not massive, but Brian, thank you for that. And also a random person from, and I always forget the name of this podcast app with the picture of the blue headphones.
Oh, that is, gosh, I know what it is too.
Yeah.
I'd go look it up on my screen, but I just said if you do that, it'll change the audio. So I'm going to leave it alone.
Yeah, exactly. So let's not do that. But anyway, I love the show, says anonymous person. Thanks for all the valuable information. And sent, I think, a total of 2,500 sats. So that's an excellent thing.
Podverse, by the way, that is the name of the app with the headphones.
Correct. Podverse, thank you. 2,100 sats from Boomy, who, now, I was wondering who Boomy was. Yeah. And it turns out that it's the other co-founder of Albi. Michael Booman, and what he has been doing is he has been using. So the Podcast Index has a directory of podcasts on their website, and some enterprising person has added Albi integration onto that, so that you can boost using the Albi browser extension from the Podcast Index website, which sounds great. If I can work out how they've done it, then I will do that from the Pod News website as well. And that's how that came in. So Michael, thank you very much. Michael Booman, thank you very much for that. And also a couple of little random boosts, one from Bisaya Podcast, 50 sats, and one from Carl, 6007, 150 sats. We got this week, and it gets split 50-50 between Sam and I, 42,299 sats, which, in case you're wondering, is about $10. Have you been using all of this value for value stuff, Eva?
I am on the value for value stuff. I have it. My show is integrated with that. About half of my clients' shows, I've turned on value for value. I have been using Fountain. I'm trying to use it as my primary listening app.
How's that
even
going?
In their new beta. Well, it's good. I'm in their beta group in Telegram, and so I've been finding some interesting things. I'm actually a lousy beta tester. What I am good, though, is doing weird edge cases, because I don't subscribe to the same methodology of what podcasting should be as Oscar does, and that's cool because there's a lot of things into it. So I'm using it different than it was intended, obviously. So providing good feedback and getting very nice comments back. When I comment, they're very thankful for my replies. So probably ignoring them because I'm the weird edge case. But yes, I am on board the train.
Because you listen to an awful lot of fiction, audio fiction, don't you? Which is a kind of a bit different in a podcast app because you kind of want to start from the beginning with that. And
typically, you want to start from the first episode. Yeah, you're not going to. I wonder what happens in chapter 7. Said no one ever. Yes, so you do want to do that, and it is a different experience. And here's the weird thing: I have been using Fountain to listen to podcast fiction exclusively for the last, let's say, 3 weeks now. None of the fiction podcasts I've listened to are value for value enabled. None.
I wonder what that says. Why would that be the case?
It's really friggin' hard.
Yeah, that's probably the
It's
thing.
too complicated. So there's a lot of things that it says about that, but yes.
Yeah. And I mean, getting easier, but still very, very difficult and complicated. If you host with RSS, then you can do some various ticking of boxes, and then you end up capturing some values somewhere, and it's still complicated. But I have to say, far easier than it was 3, 4, 5, 6 months ago.
Completely. Yeah. You and I were early adopters of it, and we're forced to learn all sorts of things that people don't have to learn now, and so that's helpful, and it'll continue to get better, I hope.
Yes, I have my little Umbral box in the kitchen, which sits there and is pulling in Bitcoin and things like that. Sam bought an Umbral box, but didn't bother plugging it in and actually getting it working.
Right.
Because,
Yeah, it's interesting to see if he's using it as a doorstop, I believe is what he's using it for now.
Too complicated. What's been happening for you this week in Podland, Evo?
Well, as you mentioned, I mostly consume fiction podcasts, but I have been doing that more and more. And fiction is where I got started. When I started podcasting back in 2004, we were a radio show back in 2002, and our radio show interviewed science fiction authors. So fiction is really where I got my beginning, and I was definitely there to encourage the usage of podcasting for fiction writers. Some of the first audio dramas are still friends of mine that I stay connected to. But I've been an avid consumer of that content, but I've never been I no longer am deeply involved. I think I got out of it around 2010 was the last time I was really heavily involved, and the game has changed. We know podcasting has changed a lot, but also podcast fiction has changed drastically, and even since I've been back and involved with the game, it continues to change. So I'm digging in deeper to that, listening, learning a lot, asking lots of questions, trying to understand what the state of fiction podcasting is today and where it might go tomorrow.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to, I think Pod News has bought some support for Greater Boston. For their next season, and they asked me how I wanted, because I've bought some advertising in there, and they asked me how I wanted the advertising to be, and I said, well, this is what Pod News does. Knock yourself out. Do whatever you want. So I'm looking forward to finding out what on earth they do with my brand.
Yeah. How that gets worked into the story. So
Yeah, exactly. How that gets worked, if indeed it does. So that should be good. You also you're based in Phoenix in Arizona, which
Yes.
I believe is a relatively cool, chilly place. I believe that you also do stuff with a club, don't you? There.
Yeah. I'm helping organize something we call the Phoenix Podcast Club, or specifically the PHX Podcast Club, phxpodcastclub.com. It is a social event. We get together once a month on the third Thursday of every month and just go to a restaurant/pub, hang out, talk podcasting, drink beer, eat food, and as a generally socialize with the world. I think podcasting is great for a lot of reasons, and we can do the whole intimate medium thing and do our drinking thing. But quite often when I go to podcast events, they're very focused on podcasting, and people have questions and they want to get trained and whatever. And those are fun if you're brand new, but they're not so fun if you know what you're doing. And I don't want to sit through a lecture of how to submit my podcast to Apple Podcasts. That's not fun. So we've taken all the education, all of that out of it, and just leave the fun. It is simply a social gathering, no agenda. Come talk about your podcast. You can talk about no agenda podcast if you want. And we're just there to have a good time and make connections, meet people, occasionally answer questions, but really just support each other and build podcasting from within. Phoenix is the 5th largest metropolitan area in the United States.
Wow.
We have a huge population. You have millions of people that live in and around the Phoenix area. And so it's great to have this little get-together every month and just see some new faces and some old faces and generally just connect.
It's one of the things that I really want to try and do. The pandemic kind of stopped all of this, but it's one of the things I really wanted to do with, we have a Brisbane podcasters sort of, get together type thing. Yep. We had a long time ago, and that has died a bit of a death, and it would be nice to get that up and running again, and find an excuse to go out in an evening and chat. There are some fiction podcasters, as well as a surprising amount of Brisbane's the third largest Australian city, and a surprising amount of people who do podcasting and audio here. The ABC's news team is based here and does a lot of large shows from here, as well as there's a company called Podshape, which also produces a lot of independent shows. There's some fiction stuff that goes on here as well, and so it would be really nice to begin to bring those types of people together once more. Perhaps I should get together with Kyrin. I should get together with Kyrin and somebody from the ABC, and we should be good.
Well, that would be a wide wide spectrum of the type of podcasting. ABC on one side and mere mortals on the other. Yeah. That's a pretty wide range in the middle. That's great. Well, feel free to steal it. Do BrizPodcast.club if you want. Take the idea and run with it. Yeah.
Yeah, BNE
podcast. Club, I think it would be. Yeah. So, James, what has happened for you in Podland this week? I know you've got some minor thing out of the way.
Yeah, not much news. Yes, I've finally managed to get married, which is very exciting. Yay! After 2 years of having to call it off and move people around and basically mess with people's lives, because half of them were flying in from the UK.
Oh my goodness! You and I have known each other for 5 or 6 years now, and it seems like as long as I've known you, you've been trying to get married.
Yes, exactly. To the same person, I should point out. So
yes, that's worth mentioning.
Yes, I'm not one of those. So that was very nice, and it was that happened over the weekend, and of course, doing a daily newsletter and a daily podcast has been relatively challenging over the last week. Yeah. But looking forward to being able to get a little bit more time before, of course, I go to Podcast Movement, which I'm also looking forward to. You'll be there as well,
right? And is that how you're celebrating your honeymoon? Podcast Movement in Dallas, Texas?
We're not doing a honeymoon, and certainly not in downtown Dallas. I've seen the grassy knoll.
Yeah.
What else is there to see?
Well, you and I are going to see plenty of good craft beer pubs all around Deep Ellum, so we're going to have a great time at that while we're there.
Yes. Mm-hmm. We should be good. So very much looking forward to that. But yes, it's been a fun week.
Excellent.
And that's it for this week. If you've liked this episode of Podland, please tell others to visit and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be back next week with another review and analysis of all things podcasting.
You'll also find all of our previous episodes and interviews on our website, podland.news. Give us feedback using a Boostagram or an email, which apparently nobody uses, so I'm not even going to mention the email address.
No, I wouldn't. If you want daily news, you should get Pod News. The newsletter's free at podnews.net. The podcast can be found in your podcast app, and all the stories we've discussed on Podland today are in the show notes. We use chapters and transcripts too.
Our music is from Ignite Jingles, and we're hosted and sponsored by our good friends Buzzsprout and Squadcast.
Yes, definitely two separate words, Buzzsprout and Squadcast.
Well, I want to make sure they get the spelling right. Buzzsprout, Squadcast. Yeah, we say that a lot of the time, but I like Buzzsprout and Squadcast. Usually they're two words that are mixed together to...
Excellent.
What do you call that? A combination of words? I don't know.
What excellent value. I keep listening.